build together, work together, and organize together to win justice for Alex Saab, together with justice for all of the causes and movements that we are working to support as part of the National Lawyers Guild International Committee. Today, we're going to be talking about the case of Alex Saab, the Venezuelan diplomat who is currently being imprisoned in a US federal detention center on charges that are directly related to defiance of the US attempt to impose regime change on Venezuela through the use of illegitimate unilateral coercive measures. Recently, a delegation of 2 National Lawyers Guild and International Association of Democratic Lawyers members visited Alex Saab in the federal detention center in Miami. Today, we'll be hearing from the delegation members, Suzanne Adely, the National Lawyers Guild president and bureau member of the International Association of Democratic Lawyers, and Audrey Bomse, longtime National Lawyers Guild International Committee member and Mass Incarceration Committee co-chair. They'll discuss the case of Alex Saab, their visit, his role as a political prisoner in the United States, the connection of the case to US sanctions, and the ongoing gag order silencing Saab and his attorneys. After we hear the presentations from Audrey and Suzanne, we'd like to move into more of a discussion. You're welcome to raise your questions and make your comments during that time. And you're also welcome to, if you don't want to speak, if you want to write your questions in the chat, please feel free to go ahead and do that as well. So once again, thank you all for joining us this afternoon or this evening. And thank you to Audrey and Suzanne for sharing your thoughts, your analysis, your experience, and your views today. So I'll turn it over to Audrey and then to Suzanne as we go through the discussion. Audrey, please welcome and go ahead.
Okay. Hi, everyone. After first, you should excuse me for the background here. I'm in a hotel. Wouldn't be the decor that I would have chosen. Just a background. You heard that the delegation was led by Suzanne, the president of the Guild. My connection mainly was that I live in Miami now, but I've also been twice to Venezuela and was familiar with the case of Alex Saab. I'll just start off with kind of my impression of our legal visit with him and several things that he said, some of which I didn't know about, other people might have, that I'll cover. First, have done a lot of prison visits and talked to prisoners for decades, and Alex Saab really struck me as being strong, despite everything that happened to him, and really steadfast in his commitment not to provide false testimony, which everybody's been trying to get him to do, both about himself and about Venezuela. He put his arrest clearly in the context of the sanctions, and certainly sees himself as a political prisoner. Concerning the effects of these sanctions and what motivated him was, on the statement that we put out, we had a quote from him that it would have been better for the US to drop a bomb on Venezuela, and that would have happened all of a sudden, then to impose sanctions by which they die every day. And it was really a compelling statement by him. I know Suzanne and I copied it down word for word. We did not speak to him about his criminal case, and that's because there's a gag order, which I didn't know about, on him and his legal team. The history of that is that the government, the U.S. government, went in for moved for a protective order because of all the media presence, both, and it stated in the judge's order about the large media attention, both in the U.S. and abroad. And it was unopposed, the order. So clearly the defense team went along with it, but that meant that we couldn't really talk to him much, pretty much at all about the case. He did say that he didn't commit any crime and he just wants to go home. He did say that, and as that gag order is one of the things that I didn't know about, and I don't know if other people did, but it's probably a reason why we know so little about the background of the case. He spoke in a lot of detail about the Swiss investigation, which I didn't know about either, of the same charge. There was a 3-year investigation by Swiss prosecutors of the same charge of basically money laundering. And after 3 years, in I think it was March 2021, the prosecution felt that was insufficient evidence to prosecute, so it was all dismissed. That was about a year after the final decision that Saab had been extradited or kidnapped to the U.S. He talked about that he knew that about the risks that he knew that he was taking. First, he went in the middle of the COVID pandemic when thousands of people were dying in Venezuela and around the world. So, as I said, he knowingly took this risk. He had been to Iran before in 2018, and he said that was at a time when food production in Iran was down by about 20%, and they couldn't buy food. They didn't have the money to buy food, nor could they get credit from the Western banking system. So they had to barter. That trip, he bartered food, Venezuelan food for Iranian food for Venezuelan crude oil. Then in 2019 was when he was charged in the U.S. with a bunch of crimes, basically all related to the sanctions and money laundering. And he was sanctioned also at this time in 2018 because they said that for allegedly profiteering from overvalued contracts in Venezuela. So he knew that there was a risk when he left in 2020. And what he thought was might happen was that the plane would get blown up. Didn't think that he would be kidnapped. He was kidnapped, and this is, as we all know, he was held in Cabo Verde without an arrest warrant. The Interpol notice came the following day. He still can't talk about what happened to him in Cabo Verde. In fact, he teared up when he tried to started to talk about it. He basically said that they did whatever they wanted to him and compared what happened to him to what was going on in Guantanamo. He was tortured and injured. His torturers, he said, spoke English without an accent, but he couldn't see them. And they wanted basically for him to make statements condemning Maduro and Venezuela in front of cameras, which he refused to do. His treatment, he was kept in solitary in a small dark cell where he said he couldn't tell day from night. There was no toilet. It was basically rough treatment. And he said that he thinks that the reason that the U.S. wanted him kept there so long was that he could be tortured, but the U.S. wouldn't be held responsible for it. And he went into a lot of detail about how he thought that the U.S. knew that the top officials in the U.S. government knew that he was on a special diplomatic visit, and that, in fact, he referred us to the book by Mike Pompeo, Trump's was Secretary of State and former CIA head, who what is the name of his book was Never Give an Inch, and it did confirm that he and others in the top government knew that Alex was involved in this humanitarian mission to barter. He also told us that there was a warship for months that was anchored off the coast of Cape Verde, and this also was confirmed. He said, and it was true, in a book by Mark Esper, who was then the Secretary of Defense, who said that the purpose for the boat being there was to avoid an attempt by either Russia or Iran to free Saab, which is like a ridiculous theory there. Just skip over this one interesting thing that he talked about was that he would like to have a consular visit in accordance with the Vienna Convention on consular affairs, which of course the problem there is that all the Venezuelan embassies and consulates in the US were first taken over by what Alex called an imaginary government that the US recognizes, and now has been have been taken over, closed by the US in violation of the Vienna Convention. So it's interesting. I don't know if there could be a demand that people from the Venezuelan mission to the UN come and see him or what. But he would like to implement his right to a consular visit. He also mentioned that he would like, if possible, to have a visit from a well-known progressive religious leader like Cornel West, if that's possible. He does get visits from his legal team, and also there are Venezuelan American lawyers who are part of that team, as well as a legal team that's set up in that's in Venezuela, headed by Leila Talgin, I think, who some of us met with when we were in Caracas. We asked him about his conditions of confinement, which are a lot better than they were in Cape Verde. He's not in solitary. He has medical issues, but he doesn't want to make an issue of it because he says everybody who complains about medical conditions ends up in the SHU, which is the special housing unit, solitary confinement. So that's basically it from the perspective of that's what happened in the meeting. I think that what we need to talk about now is analysis of what the aim of the meeting is, of the prosecution is, the chilling effect that it obviously has on anybody trying to break the sanctions, and what we can do to help out. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Audrey, for this informative and helpful discussion of your own experience and what you discussed with Alex Saab, despite this gag order imposed upon him, preventing him from having the full conversation that he should be able to have with progressive lawyers who want to provide support. And now we're going to turn to our NLG president, Suzanne Adely, who will be speaking more about the visit as well as about the political context in which this entire case is taking place. Welcome, Suzanne.
Thanks, Charlotte, and thanks, Audrey, for covering all that important information. As Audrey mentioned, she and I, along with some of our other colleagues, met Alex's wife, Camila, and some of his lawyers in Venezuela in late 2021. We had known about the case already at that time. We were in Venezuela acting as election monitors for the local elections. But we had the opportunity when we were there to, meet Alex's wife and some of the legal team and learn some more details about the case. And so, when we came back to the US, we were trying to continue to learn as much as we can because, we really kind of understood the political implications of the case. And we first put out our own statement with legal analysis last year, sometime early last year. And we knew that it did gain a lot of attention. And I think particularly because, it was a time when the case was receiving more publicity and the movement to support Alex was growing. And I think that, it's continuing to grow. And that's part of the reason why we wanted to visit Alex. I mean, I think first and foremost is to really sort of just check on, the conditions of his detention, as Audrey stated, and then try to get, some idea if that there was something that we could use our legal platform to do to advocate for him and his, current experience. But we also wanted to express to Alex that, there is a growing movement to free him. And we wanted to use the visit as an opportunity to build some more awareness of the case and build some more momentum in the US in particular, to get more supporters and get more folks who are learning about the case and then rightfully, holding and rightfully kind of exposing the role, like the actions of the US government. We know that there's also, other parts of the world where folks are paying attention to the case. There was actually just a very large meeting that took place in Italy that I also participated in, where folks were talking about the case and the political implications and what is it that we need to be doing. And as Audrey said, Alex was really kind of visibly exhausted, but very willing to talk to us. And it was useful for us to sort of hear from him the narrative of his experience, and it helped us sort of to gain a little bit more clarity as to sort of the bigger picture. But we went into that meeting a few weeks ago and had already been, I guess, over a month since the latest ruling in December in the federal court in the hearing in regards to Alex Saab's immunity, right? And the ruling in that hearing, I think, was very telling of the political context, right? The evidence or, the facts, I think, that were laid before the court that, Alex Saab was acting as a diplomat, as a special envoy for Venezuela, I think we're very clear. There was also kind of additional evidence that was offered to the court that showed that both the Trump and Biden administrations had considered Alex Saab to be a special envoy. And but the federal court not only ignored that evidence, they went so far as to say in their ruling that even if Alex Saab, was a special envoy, was a diplomat who would, traditionally be afforded immunity, the fact of the matter is that, the Biden administration or the U.S. government doesn't recognize the legitimacy of the Maduro government. So anybody therefore appointed to be a diplomat by the Maduro government is not a diplomat, right? And it's just a very blatant, direct kind of exposure of how the U.S. courts are really used, are really ignoring the rule of law in many instances, and really kind of like being used to entrench further and legitimize U.S. imperialist policies or our U.S. imperialist framework, right? And also, Alex, he made a comment saying that, like, when he walked into court that day and heard the judge referring to the Maduro regime, he knew from that moment that, like, this wasn't going to turn out in his favor, right? Because the political tone was evident from the beginning, Audrey, talked about how Alex Saab discussed with us basically his, his feelings around the sanctions or the economic coercive measures that have been laid against Venezuela, which he was saying really started from the very moment that Chavez came to power in Venezuela, right? Maybe not with official sanctions, but the economic pressure from the United States started to take place right from the beginning, right? And then since then, with the sort of expansion, the increase of these economic coercive measures against Venezuela, the situation has really become really dire. It's been dire, it's been serious, it's been very impactful, it's been violating, for a very long time. And Alex, really, when you hear him talk about the impact of those policies and, the value the value of his role in trying to challenge them, right? It really is, his sort of desire to put himself in that role, or his willingness to put himself in that role despite the threats, right? To, be able to challenge these policies on behalf of Venezuela and this, political socialist project in Venezuela that, like, he really believes in, and there was a very sort of powerful thing to sort of hear his narrative, right? But I think, talking about the sanctions and economic coercive measures, one of the things that the NLG is engaged in right now, along with several other North American and global-based organizations, is in January, we launched something called the International People's Tribunal on U.S. imperialism, looking at sanctions, blockades, and other types of economic coercive measures imposed most often by countries like the U.S., but not exclusively, sometimes also imposed by the UN, and sometimes also imposed or supported by other, imperialist states and so on. And so in that project, we're looking at the impact of these kinds of economic coercive measures on several countries throughout the global South, including Venezuela. We're actually going to be closing out the tribunal in Venezuela. And a lot of why we decided to do that, right, is because firstly, we think that it's really important for the world to be aware of how these policies are impacting ordinary people, how they are being used to commit human rights violations, and how they have manifested as a kind of economic warfare, how and why these policies are being used to support U.S. imperialist policies, right? As a kind of imperialist domination, as a kind of method for provoking instability and regime change in places where the United States is trying to maintain its power. We're using the tribunal as a way to build political education around these policies, as well as a way to build a movement, a global movement against these policies using both legal and political tools, right? And so a lot of like the analysis that we have been bringing to this tribunal around the use of these kinds of policies is that, following from what I was just saying, is that we see these policies as a tool of imperialist domination, right? And particularly capitalist imperialist domination, right? I mean, what these policies essentially do, in addition to create grave human rights violations, is they're meant to sort of undercut the sovereignty of states like Venezuela, like Cuba, like Palestine or Syria, or and we see it also as being a tool to maintain global economic inequality, or global economic dependency of the global South to the Western sort of like capitalist economy, right? Capitalist imperialist economy. And when when states like Venezuela and Cuba and others work for their own sovereignty and work for their own economic self-determination, that's when they become a target of these policies of countries like the U.S. And in many ways, Alex Saab has been, as Audrey said, when we asked him, do you consider yourself to be a political prisoner? He said, indeed, I am a political prisoner. There's no, he can't think of another case more political than his, right? And we walked away discussing how Alex in particular was being used as a pawn of U.S. imperialist policies against Venezuela, right? His role in challenging the sanctions, in working with their ally, Iran, who is another target of the United States, and acting in solidarity with them to challenge the sanctions, to overcome the impact of the sanctions, to try to neutralize the sanctions, has made him our target of the United States. And that sort of is why we see such a kind of vigilant prosecution and against him, starting from when he was detained and kidnapped in Cape Verde, and then brought to the United States, detained in Miami, and then undergoing these trials that we know have been politically biased. And so, as Audrey said, this case is sort of meant to have a chilling effect against others who might see themselves in the future also trying to play a similar role in trying to overcome these kinds of policies on behalf of the countries that they come from. And so we wanted to, again, use this opportunity to engage in discussion with all of you, and perhaps you might have more specific questions about some of the things that Audrey brought up or that I brought up, but we really also would like to sort of spend a little bit of time talking about what is it that we can be doing, and what more can we be doing to raise awareness around the case, but also to support Alex as he's being detained, but also to support his case in general.
Thank you so much, Suzanne. And thank you to Audrey and Suzanne for your analysis and for your comments. and for everything that you've already shared with us today. Just want to ask everybody if you'd like to make a comment, if you'd like to raise a question, please use the raise hand function in Zoom if possible. If you have trouble using that function, please just post in the chat that you would like to make a comment or ask a question. But I'll start off the question and answer discussion by turning to both Suzanne and Audrey with a question for thoughts. But before I do that, I want to also just as a reminder to folks and maybe an introduction to folks who don't already know about this, the National Lawyers Guild is part of a large-scale effort that's taking place right now, the International People's Tribunal on U.S. imperialism, sanctions, blockades, and unilateral coercive measures. Venezuela is one of the focus countries among many others, and we're holding a series of hearings dealing with the effects of U.S. economic coercive measures directed at countries around the world, and what the effects of those are, certainly as a form of war, but also as a form, as Suzanne was saying, as a form of economic extraction and exploitation. Tomorrow evening, there will be a hearing on the US sanctions on Korea, and specifically on the Democratic People's Republic of Korea on North Korea. I'll put the Zoom link, I put the link to our website in the chat, and I'll put those Zoom link to register for the hearing. That hearing will take place at 8 p.m. Pacific and 11 p.m. Eastern tomorrow evening. And so we invite you to join us for that as well. So one of the first questions is really direct. Is there anything that Alex himself, or through your experience in organizing for the liberation of prisoners or fighting back against sanctions, that you would automatically see as something that all of us should, take with us to do and to take action to free Alex Saab?
You want to start, Audrey?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we have to keep organizing and getting the word out as lawyers and people and legal workers, students. We should be raising it within the Bar Association, although I am aware that most of us are not members of the various bar associations, but there should be demonstrations when the trial resumes. It's paused now because there's an appeal going up on the issue of diplomatic immunity. But I imagine that it's going to lose. I think it would be interesting to think of, since the outcome, it's a political trial, the outcome is going to be political. Chances are that he's going to be convicted. We should think about, out of the box, something like the prisoner swaps could happen. What individuals could be doing, of course, is writing letters to him if people are interested in it, because he really is isolated. Interested, they should contact us and we'll give you the information, because you can't just write to him. You need his detainee number. That's about it. I mean, he's in a bad situation. That's what happens, to political prisoners. So we just have to make it clear to him and to others that he's not alone, that we're in solidarity with him.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything that Audrey said. And I think writing letters to him is a very good idea. And continuing to make noise about the case and continuing to educate others about the case and its political implications, and holding protests and so on. I think all of that is really important.
Thank you so much, Suzanne and Audrey. We have some comments and questions in the chat. We've also already started getting requests for Alex Saab's address to write letters in prison. But I see Elizabeth Lee, you have your hand raised. Would you like to ask a question or make a comment?
Oh, I want to make a comment. I've been listening to a lot of things, and I think I've really started to feel like things are very, very difficult. Of course, it's easy to say that, but when I listened to the hearings, when I spent the 2 days, it was sort of hard to believe that where we live, especially Canada, that this is all going on, and it seems like we're so removed where we are, but not really. And today, when I was listening on the news, when Biden shot those balloons down and they didn't turn to be out anything but somebody's balloon, he just blew them out of the water and then they couldn't find them. Imagine that. And he just said, well, we'll just do it. If anything's gonna, affect the United States. And I listened to him, and it was very chilling how he said it. But it's the same voice that's all through Canada. Like, we do not have any political leaders at this moment that are worth anything. And they're all the same. And I was kind of really, I feel very sad and rageful at the same moment. But I realized before they had the Second World War in Nazi Germany, this was precisely word for word what was going on in the background, and the people were removed from it if you weren't the people that they had their eye on. And this has been very clear to me, like, I guess last year. I mean, it was so clear, but it's like you see this conversation that's going on over our heads as if we're supposed to understand everything and just say, oh, that's all right. But it's almost paralyzing in a way. And I don't want to sound depressed, because I'm not going to be depressed, if you know what I'm trying to say. But I think just if I know Amnesty International for years, when they really were something, that people would write letters, hundreds and thousands of letters. And it was recorded that the jailers would say, we wouldn't have let you go, but so many people, we didn't want to get any more mail. So I think just even doing that, regardless of what the courts are doing, that's one thing we can all do, and we can just be consistent about. And I'm not just speaking, I'm speaking to myself, but this came to me, and I guess I just really appreciate people like yourself that put these webinars together and come with all this information and remind us what's really going on. But thank you. I really do appreciate everything you do.
Right. I'd like to respond. Thank you for that comment, Elizabeth. I think that you're right. I mean, I think on one level, we have to think about all the different strategies that can be used to support Alex and to advocate for his freedom, including, doing something simple like writing letters to him to boost his morale is valuable, right? But also writing letters to politicians about the injustice in this case, as much as possible, as you mentioned, I think is also really valuable, right? I think, doing any kind of advocacy that we've done for other political prisoners, like, in the United States, I think it could also be really important, maybe in continuing to educate people about the case. Maybe there's more media that can be done, maybe a documentary, about the case as well, But I also get your kind of frustration, right? Because the thing is that, like, this case is it's just reflective of something really much bigger, right? Which is the US empire, and the fact that, like, I was just at a law symposium with a couple of international lawyers, very well-known international law professors, who made the joke that, oh, we all know that international law doesn't apply to the United States, right?
Yeah, we all say that,
and that's the truth of the matter. I mean, and what we're seeing is kind of like the extension of, like,
real life.
or decades, if not a century or more, of
Yeah.
U.S. policy in Latin America, right? In the Americas, and their need, whether it's Republican or Democrat, to kind of like have control over, what's happening in Cuba, what's happening in Venezuela, what's happening in Colombia, right, and elsewhere. And that's the challenge, because that's the piece of this puzzle that so many people are not aware of in this country, right? The fact, or at least not paying attention to, the fact that the United States could just go to Cape Verde and kidnap somebody the way they used to go and kidnap random people and bring them to Guantanamo, right? The fact that they can do that in the world with total impunity is
Right.
reality of U.S. empire, that that's a longer term goal and struggle that we need to sort of educate people, because there's a lot that we can do in the short term, to advocate for Alex, right? But we also kind of have to do what we can for people to see that it's connected to something much larger. And we've seen it manifested in other cases, like the Cuban Five, or Simone Trinidad, or Ana Montes, who was just released,
Haiti, Canada announced it's sending a huge ship with soldiers to Haiti, because they were asked by Haiti because of all these gangs and that. Well, I don't know about that, but we've been praying, a lot of us, that Canada doesn't go to Haiti, because they're responsible for the whole disaster, and they're going to send they're going to land there and do it all over again. And I guess it's this isn't just 100 years or 200 years. This is beginning of, after the Roman Empire, we got the European Empire. We got that. And so people of color all over the world, I don't know how they ever keep standing up, because of, this isn't just the United States. This is just, they have bigger weapons now, right? They can do drones over people, and they don't care if they hit somebody. It's just a joke. So before, they had to use spears, right? So it seemed more equal, but it's still, this has been going on for the beginning of colonization, which was basically the Roman Empire started. So it's just that we thought that we knew more, but we didn't know anything. And none of my friends and none of my children do not want to listen to me. I have the only recourse is when I want something like this, because they can't handle it. They say, I can only do this much, Mom. They cannot face the fact that we are destructing. It doesn't have to be that way, but we are being destroyed from within, like a toxin.
Can I just respond to a larger, the issue that you're raising, that the U.S., which talks about so much about rules-based international order. There's see the implications of this Saab's case, not only in the context of sanctions, but also on international law. Right, he was arrested without a warrant. He was extradited without an extradition treaty. And just think of the implications. The Cape Verde Attorney General said that they don't need a bilateral treaty, because he said reciprocity between Cape Verde and the US under UN conventions on crime fighting permitted. Now just think of the implications of that. Or the implication of the US kidnapping, because they don't recognize the appointing power. I don't know how many governments the US thinks of are illegitimate, but that means they can just kidnap anybody, on that basis, and make them political prisoners. So it's the implications are huge of the case.
Right.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much, Audrey and Elizabeth and Suzanne. There's been a lot of comments in the chat, and so I want to get to some of those as well. Just to note, in terms of Canada's role. There's a note about an event upcoming that has been put into the chat from others that are here on the call as well, I think from Fire This Time, that people can participate in to talk about Canada's role in Venezuela. And of course, there's also been a not unrelated case that involved Canada very heavily, which was the case of Meng Wanzhou, who was a Chinese business executive who was held in Canada for extradition for a lengthy period of time to the United States. And again, the issue there was about quote unquote violation of US sanctions on Iran. So once again, it was actually using third party countries in the same way that we see in the Alex Saab case to attempt to force an extradition of people who are not subjects of the United States, to attempt to compel them through criminal charges to comply with US sanctions regimes that are aimed at regime change around the world. Just to go to some of the comments in the chat, we have one from Katarina Lai Cullinan, who says that Nicaragua has reached 85% of food independence by working with farmers. Eritrea has weaned itself off of foreign aid. People are fighting back against economic warfare, and the cruelty against Alex is the US response. We also have two questions that are directly connected. And so I'm going to read out both of those to Suzanne and Audrey. Francis Lawrence asks, if Biden eventually recognizes the Venezuelan government, does that change the situation in any way? And Christine Gonzalez asks, how is it that the US recognizes Maduro's Venezuela for oil, but not in terms of diplomacy?
I can take the first part of that. If the Biden regime recognizes Maduro government, that would have only had an effect on whether on his claim of diplomatic immunity. I mean, that's being decided now. I was wondering why they didn't go for reconsideration of the verdict based on the fact that there's no more imaginary government to call legitimate. But now we're past that. Whatever, unless the appellate court rules in his favor, the issue now just is the criminal offense. So I don't think that would change anything. And what was the second question?
Well, it was related. It was asking, how does the US justify recognizing the Maduro government as the real government of Venezuela when it comes time to make an oil deal, but not when it comes to recognizing the right of that government to have diplomats?
But I don't think the US cares if anybody doesn't like it. That's the ultimate power. Like, they don't care. Nobody can hold them account. Nobody, because Europe is upset because they're paying 10 times the price of oil because the US blew up the Russian pipeline, and they thought that was fine until they started paying the price of the oil. So they don't care. I mean, that's what I lived with mental illness my whole life as a child from my father, and this is what there's no accountability and there's no sense. It's insanity. Yeah, because you don't care. They don't care.
Yeah.
They actually think that with all their weapons that
I think that also it just has to do with US is motivated by their corporate interests, right? And they are also motivated by their ability to sort of maintain control to further those those sort of like security and corporate interests, but even the security interests are connected to corporate interests as well, so they're going to be in a bind as far as the global oil supply, and they can negotiate with Maduro, then they'll do it, right? I mean, they've always had backroom kind of like dealings with nations that they publicly didn't recognize, right? Or publicly kind of like, because, you know, there's just different things that they have to do. But but their actions in terms of, making, in terms of like, stating that they don't see Maduro's government as being legitimate or democratically elected, added to that was their attempts to make Juan Guaido president of Venezuela, which I think backfired like backfired in a big way for them, right? Because nobody was supporting that move by the United States. Not even a lot of the opposition forces in Venezuela were supporting that move, right? But they still maintain that they only recognize the National Assembly and they don't recognize Maduro. I mean, it's just something that they're going to continue to do because that's the narrative that they're putting out to justify the sanctions, right? I mean, just like when we were monitoring the elections for the National Assembly, which we saw as being, very kind of like clearly kind of elections that were facilitated in a very transparent way, and, we knew that the United States was going to try to delegitimize the election process and delegitimize, the results, and because they need to do that in order to justify the continuation of the sanctions and the continuations of the policies that will kind of ultimately let them instead support, the installment of a government that is better for U.S. interests. I mean, they've done that also in other countries as well, right? Also kind of contributing to, even if they weren't directly the ones, and contributing to the delegitimizing of like other leaders that have been democratically elected in Latin America, whether that be like in Bolivia or in Honduras as well, like, that's just kind of the narrative, like that's just one of the narrative tools that they use. But they're always going to have these kind of like backroom sort of like deals around money and resources if they need that, for another agenda,
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Suzanne, for that. Just to go through some more of these comments and questions in the chat, Martha Schmidt says, in reference to what both you and Audrey were saying, this is what the US government calls the so-called rules-based international order. The US makes up new rules in defiance of international standards that are expected of every other state. And we have a question from David Paul, who asks, what explanation does the US give for how they justify being able to prosecute a non-US citizen for doing something in another country? And so David's asking for the legal justification that the US is providing there. And I might as well just take one more comment before I turn it back to both of you again, which is from Katerina Laikulinen, who says, I understand the frustration that's being expressed in the dialogue with Elizabeth earlier. I feel that the only solution may be a prisoner swap. I wonder if a swap could be made with a third country in Latin America and beyond. So Suzanne and Audrey, would you like to comment or respond to any of those?
Well, the prisoner swap that raised is really interesting as humanitarian gesture by both sides. But that means there has to be somebody in Venezuela, a U.S. citizen, for there to be at least one of importance for there to be a swap. I think that said before, I don't see a successful outcome of this trial, so that may be the only way to get him home.
Right.
And what did you say? What is the justification?
Yeah, like how do they make a legal justification for their right to have a prosecution of Alex Saab?
Because they're charging that the money laundering happened in the U.S. And they're going to bring in a whole bunch of supposed witnesses about that. I said, I don't know very much about the criminal charges, and we couldn't talk to him about it, but that's the basis. They're saying there was money laundered within the US. And that,
Right.
by the way, is the same charge that Switzerland investigated and found that there was
No
no
basis.
evidence or insufficient evidence.
And it's just that it's just one laundering charge now too, right, Audrey? Like the rest.
Yes,
Rest-
because the other charges were dropped
Right.
as part of the agreement that when Cape Verde let him go out,
Right.
let the US kidnap him.
But I think what Katerina brings up about the prisoner swap is sounds like an idea that should be pursued for sure. Because as
Yes.
Audrey said, we don't see we don't see a good outcome in the courts. I mean, it's clearly a political case. It's clearly being adjudicated through a political, imperialist lens, right? And particularly, at the last hearing, and I'm sure, we will see again if we ever kind of get to the criminal case against this one laundering charge. And somebody asked about, like, can we is there something that can be done when the US courts ignore international law? And the US courts are often ignoring international law, right? Or kind of disrespecting international rule of law, like, or undervaluing international law very much so in their courts. But this is also like, another example of blatantly kind of like using the courts as a platform to legitimize further entrench US imperialist policies. And we've seen that in other types of cases as well, where the US government is really using these cases in a lot of ways for them to mount a political the courts become almost like a political theater for the US government, like to prosecute people and make these outrageous kind of pronouncements through the court proceedings about the illegitimacy of Venezuela, or the free democracy in Israel, or the terrorism of activists, or like the terrorism of freedom fight. Like, US government is often using these courts as kind of a political theater to push forth their kind of imperialist and narratives. And I think Alex Saab's case is one of the cases where that is happening.
Yeah, can I just add that there was a question about what venue you could go to challenge the US violating international law. There's the International Criminal Court, International Court of Justice. The problem there is it has no enforcement. I mean, Nicaragua, way back, I think in the 80s, took the US to the International Court of Justice and about the mining of its ports.
Right.
And they won. The US ignored it.
Exactly.
Venezuela now has a case in front of the International Court of Justice about the illegality of sanctions.
Right.
It's going to take a long time, and even if they win, the US will likely ignore it.
So I heard a bit of an update on that the ICC complaint by Venezuela recently, whereas the current ICC prosecutor has reduced its agenda down to 2 cases, and Venezuela's complaints is one of them, right? So if they agree to an investigation, then the complaint will be I think sort of then
that's the complaint against Venezuela.
No,
There's a complaint like that in the ICJ
I'm
about
talking about the
Venezuelan repression.
International Criminal Court.
Okay.
Venezuela filed a complaint around US sanctions. And it's now one of the top 2 priorities of the current prosecutor. So there is a chance that then Venezuela will get to appear in front of a panel of 3 judges to consider that complaint. And in that case, civil society organizations and legal organizations like ours can write letters and interventions to support the merits of that complaint. So we should be monitoring that process.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So some of the other questions that have also come in the chat include from Odongo Odio, who says, how about mobilizing more US-based support, including protests at the courts during his trial? So to organize grassroots protests at the courts during his trial. Another question that was sort of a follow-up to that was, what role can the UN play in this case? Is there a role from the UN? It looks like the UN has already been captured by Western imperialism. Can some spirited advocacy be targeted at the United Nations?
As far as demonstrations in Miami in front of the courthouse, it does happen. It happened every time the trial opens. And I think it's going to happen again. You know, people in the vicinity of Miami should come down. I mean, last time there were about 50 people. You know, and it is important. It doesn't even have to be at the courthouse. When the trial starts, it would be good to have protests all around the country about it. As far as, you know, the UN, I agree that it's kind of at this point being used by the US, and so is the International Criminal Court. I mean, this new prosecutor is investigating Afghanistan, but only for the criminal war crimes committed by the Taliban, not by the US. You can see it's the US and the West dominate unfortunately, the International Criminal Court at this point, and probably the ICJ, but that, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, that doesn't mean that there can't still be attempts to sort of raise the case, like in the UN Human Rights Council or elsewhere. But like Audrey said, you know, it's kind of, you know, we know how this works. I mean, even, you know, there was a General Assembly vote recently around the blockade on Cuba, and every General Assembly member, I think, except the United States and Israel, voted to end the blockade on Cuba. And, you know, even with that acknowledgement, the majority of the world wants the blockade to be lifted. It's not necessarily going to lead to any actions except to help to sort of build momentum, you know, for the movement to end the blockade. So, you know, I think at the most, the UN is an arena for political awareness more than anything. And, you know, the question of whether or not it puts pressure on the United States is like, unfortunately, it looks like it doesn't. You know, it hasn't.
Yeah, thank you. Just in terms of this discussion about various kinds of actions that people can take, there is a comment here from Allison Bodine from Fire This Time, sending greetings and solidarity and thanking us for organizing the discussion, and to Suzanne and Audrey for visiting Alex Saab in prison, and inviting people to a monthly online picket action for US-Canada hands-off Venezuela, free Alex Saab on Tuesday, February 28th. And there's a link in the chat, so please check that out to everyone that's here. David Paul also comments, we also need to put this case and other violations of law and basic human rights in the context of the US attempts to coerce all the challenges our dominance, and that will only lead to more conflicts and insecurity in the world for all people. Judith Merkinson notes it's interesting that the US has changed its relationship to Venezuela in terms of the border as it has with Cuba and Nicaragua. Scott Campus says potentially a hopeful sign of declining US hegemony overall, and that he was the best they could find, as is the possibility of a Brazilian Argentine foreign exchange currency. And just some comments in solidarity with Alex Saab, noting that he is a Venezuelan diplomat who's being kidnapped and tortured by the US government from various people. And there are some other questions as well. But before I ask that question, I see Katerina, did you want to ask a question? I see you have your mic on.
Oh, sorry. Well, my position is I'm despondent because I don't think that legally there is anything that can be done. What I'm thinking is that Venezuela is in a difficult moment, but there are emerging forces in Latin America that could put pressure. What I don't understand, seeing that this is a precedent which poses a threat to everyone, and not only in Latin America, why other countries which have much more sway and much more weight in the US politics and US behavior in Latin America is not intervening, not necessarily the prisoner swap. I mean, there was, but they could put quite a lot of pressure, and they haven't. I found that the response of the continent quite muted, and it is a human case. It's not just a political case. There is a real flesh and blood person we're talking about. So my issue is, instead of waiting for the SUR and the new currency and financial currency in Latin America, which would bypass the sanctions because the money wouldn't go through Miami or New York anymore. And that would solve some of the problems where the sanctions, at least in Latin America, are concerned. We have still an issue of someone which is, imprisoned and whose health is not taken care of. I don't know that much of the American system, but I don't think we can wait that long. So I'm wondering what the other countries are doing, where Bolivia, Colombia, Argentina, Brazil are, where Alex Saab is concerned, because it does concern them as well. They have diplomats around the world. And that was all. Sorry.
Thank you, Katerina.
Yeah, I think, Katerina, you make a very good point, and I think that's part of what we can do as particularly international lawyers that have connections in some of these other states, is just to try to open those conversations to see what can be done.
Yeah, there are, so just to go back to some of these other comments that have come in, some of these things have already been addressed, like in terms of the ways in which the US and its allied imperialist powers continue to insist. Now there's no legitimate government in Venezuela, although if there's something that needs to happen in Venezuela, they all know where to go, and that is the actual government of Venezuela. And Dennis is saying, is there really any government that the US has in its crosshairs that the US recognizes as legitimate, just pointing out that the US constantly delegitimizes and manufactures kind of pretext to reject the governments that provide some kind of challenge to the United States. There is a factual question here that you might have more insight into, Audrey and Suzanne, which is if there is a conviction on this one money laundering charge in the United States, what would the likely sentence be for that? And I mean, and that's a question from Francis Lawrence, of course, noting that this entire process is extremely political because as Alejandro Castillo notes, it was completely based on the US government's non-recognition of President Nicolas Maduro. So is there, do you have any idea what the sentence what sentence they would try to impose upon Alex Saab if they were able to convict him on these charges?
So I'm not sure, but I imagine it's serious, and he will get at least the maximum sentence if he's found guilty, which he will, and it may be added to it because at some point in the judge in his decision implied, not even implied, said that some of the evidence that was produced in Alex Saab's favor was fraudulent. You know, it's serious. He's facing a long time.
Yeah, and clearly from what you're saying, there's an attempt to bring anything in that could possibly accentuate the sentence, like claiming that evidence is fraudulent and so on and so forth. Building on Katerina's comment from before, there are several comments here including hers, that a precedent that devalues the role of diplomats is a threat to every country. If Venezuela doesn't have a notable prisoner to be swapped, other countries may. Similarly, Martha Schmidt notes the US manipulation of international diplomatic standards is going to tear a huge hole in the UN system. It's a state-based system that relies on a minimum level of trust, and the Saab case affects all negotiations and diplomacy. And in this context, she also noted that Venezuela has been prevented from even voting at the United Nations because it can't pay its dues as a result of the US sanctions and the unilateral coercive measures. So there's this really kind of cycle that's taking place of the silencing and persecution of Venezuela. And Judith Merkinson also notes that we're seeing the same kind of complete disregard for any meaningful standards with this idea of a multinational force invading Haiti. And there are some discussions about various kinds of potential prisoner swap possibilities. Susan Scott notes, of course, if you're going to avoid illegal United States unilateral coercive measures, you'd have to launder your money. Money laundering in the name of defiance of US unilateral coercive measures should be lauded and protected by UN resolutions, and also just provide some more information on. Yeah, so great comment, Susan. There's also some information here from Susan about the ICC case. There's an ICC case against the Venezuelan government, as one is the one by the Venezuelan government against sanctions. And of course, the one the ICC is pursuing is the one against the Venezuelan government alleging human rights abuses during the demonstrations against the election of Maduro in 2017. Roger Harris says that a 20-year sentence has been suggested for conviction on a conspiracy to launder money. And we also have a question here from Drake Myers that I definitely want to turn back to you, Audrey and Suzanne, because this is actually an issue that isn't just limited to the Alex Saab case, but it's something that comes up in a lot of criminal cases in the United States generally, but almost always in the political criminal cases, which is that, oh, we hear that he's now being charged with conspiracy to money launder rather than money laundering itself. What is the difference between a charge itself and a conspiracy charge about that offense?
It's much easier to convict on conspiracy. It's like, you know, a wheel with the spokes. If anybody from one of those spokes has done anything illegal, a legal act, it applies to all of them, to everybody there. And there are people that are going to be called. There's some professor in Florida who says he was in business with Alex. Who knows what pressure they were under, or if they were agents to begin with. But if he admits to actions and is found to be part of the conspiracy with Alex, then Alex is responsible. So it's much broader and it's much easier to convict.
Right. Yeah.
Thank you. And
We just
go
know
ahead,
that
please.
We just know that from criminal law 101. It's just much easier to convict.
Exactly. And so it's definitely something that wanted to highlight that question, because this isn't the only case
Yeah.
where you're going to be hearing about conspiracy charges. Whenever, Suzanne, please go ahead.
No, we're all conspiring right now.
And so you'll notice, if you look at almost all of the, I mean, at any kind of criminal case, because it becomes kind of a shortcut for the prosecution in general, but certainly any kind of politically motivated criminal case in the US, you will almost certainly always see conspiracy charges as part of that case. And that this is something that is kind of routinely abused, in that the abuse is built into the system itself. And so we're seeing it again here in this case. It also tends to lessen a lot of the requirements of things they would have to show the charge itself. And yet in many cases, the sentencing is almost the same, if not the same itself. There are several other just comments in here supporting Alex Saab. Dulce Blanco says, our diplomat Alex Saab must be released. Enough of so much injustice. Lilia Maria Mendez Parra says, it has been shown that the case of the diplomat Alex Saab is political and not legal. They have even accused him of promoting global warming, and there is no proof of the crimes against him. In the midst of this chaos, the solution could also be political. There is room for a prisoner exchange, some of the topic that has been brought up before. Those are all of the comments that we've received so far in the chat. We've gone through them, but I do want to turn back to invite everyone again that if you have a question or a comment, please raise your hand or put it in the chat, but also to turn back to Audrey and Suzanne for any, kind of additional comments, summing up, calls to action that you would like to share with everybody.
It would be good when if the appeal is denied and the case is sent back to the district court in Miami, for people certainly in the South to show up. It's important for the judge to see, as well as for Alex Saab to see, and it's important for there to be demonstration outside. And as I said, it would be great for there to be demonstrations throughout the country when that happens. And I just want to emphasize again, writing letters is important. I mean, he's really kind of isolated here.
Right. Yeah, I would say writing letters, and we can expand. We can make sure that people know that they can do that and how they can do that. And I think also continuing to mobilize at the hearings. And we know kind of Miami is kind of like a difficult place to raise those kinds of politics. Like, yeah, that makes a big difference sometimes, but I think we need to do our best to do that. I think we need to also just continue to inform new people about the case and its implications. We need to talk about it in kind of like a human rights context, but also in this context of how it's linked to, sanctions and sovereignty of these kinds of nations, and the actions of the U.S. empire. And I think that, Katarina, I think, your question about what about these other states that have a little bit more influence with the United States, who would also be sympathetic to Alex in Venezuela, right? I think that that's a really important question. And, and we have, through our legal associations, NLG and IADL, we have, and we work closely with the American Association of Jurists. I think that that's certainly in conversations that are worth us pursuing, and particularly with diplomats that we might know, to see where there might be an opportunity for dialogue on this. I don't know of any specific action items right now, but I think that, we're all kind of connected to each other through different, social media and email listservs and so on. And so we can definitely follow up with any specific action items. And maybe there are other people on the call who have some.
I just want to respond to the question of from Judith Murkison about publications. I'm not sure, but I'll ask the criminal lawyer team.
I think also we're also going to kind of look more into this request for him to get a consular visit. And I think that might emerge as a mini campaign on its own. And then we certainly would be in touch with folks about an action for supporting that. Mm-hmm.
Yes, thank you so much. We do have, just of the stuff that's been in the chat, Roger Harris has just posted a link to join the campaign to free Alex Saab. And earlier, Alison Bodine had posted the link to the February 28th online event to free Alex Saab. Excuse me. Sorry. In addition, I just want to remind everybody once again that tomorrow evening is the next hearing of the People's Tribunal on U.S. imperialism, sanctions, blockades, coercive economic measures. This particular hearing is going to be focusing on the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. In the future, we are going to be focusing on Venezuela. In fact, the closing hearing for the entire tribunal is going to be held live in Venezuela. So we're going to be speaking about Cuba, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Nicaragua, Syria, Yemen, Iraq, Iran, Sudan, and about many other countries. Haiti, we're going to be speaking about the case of the Hawaiian Kingdom, which is something that's been explored, that's being supported in the National Lawyers Guild. So I just want to encourage people once again to visit the Sanctions Tribunal website and register for the upcoming sessions. We'd love to see you there because we're working to do two things. One is to create a basis of support for the political movement to fight back against unilateral coercive measures, but also to help support potential future causes of action to challenge these kinds of attacks and to challenge U.S. imperialism, both legally and politically, in support of those who are engaging in this struggle directly on an ongoing and daily basis. So please do join us tomorrow night for the Korea hearing. Thank you once again to everyone who's joined us today. We'll send the link to the recording of this meeting to all of you, and we'll also be in touch about additional information, actions, and campaigns that could be useful to you moving forward as well. Thank you once again.
Thank you, Charlotte, for organizing this.
And of course, yes, big thanks to everyone who's joined us today, to everyone who participated in the discussion, and of course, to Suzanne and to Audrey for taking up this delegation and for providing us all with this important information and analysis that we need to build the campaign to free Alex Saab, to bring these sanctions and unilateral coercive measures to an end, and to fight back against U.S. imperialism. Thanks again, everybody. Have a good evening, and we look forward to seeing all of you and celebrating together when Alex Saab is finally free.
Yes.
Bye, everyone.